Well, we're back in Romans chapter 1, I think, for the last time. Lord willing, next week we will make the jump to Romans chapter 2. But let's read Romans 1. I'm going to read verses 20 and following for us again, just so we remind ourselves of the context of what it is we're discussing. Romans 1 verse 20 says, "For his invisible attributes, namely his eternal power and divine nature, have been clearly perceived ever since the creation of the world in the things that have been made. So they are without excuse. For although they knew God, they did not honor him as God or give thanks to him. But they became futile in their thinking, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Claiming to be wise, they became fools and exchanged the glory of the immortal God for images resembling mortal man and birds and animals and creeping things. Therefore God gave them up in the lusts of their heart to impurity, to the dishonoring of their bodies among themselves, because they exchanged the truth of God for a lie, and worshipped and served the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. For this reason, God gave them up to a dishonorable passions. For their women exchanged natural relations for those that are contrary to nature. And the men likewise gave up natural relations with women and were consumed with passion for one another, men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty for their error. And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done. They were filled with all manner of unrighteousness, evil, covetousness, malice. They are full of envy, murder, strife, deceit, maliciousness. They are gossips, slanderers, haters of God, insolent, haughty, boastful, inventors of evil, disobedient to parents, foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. Though they know God's righteous decree, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. This is the word of the Lord. We said last week you can work your way through Paul's opening arguments in Romans chapter 1 through kind of a question-answer type format. Paul begins by introducing himself, and then he says, I'm obligated to preach the gospel. And the question he expects in return is, why? Why, Paul? Why are you obligated to this message? And he says, because it's not a shameful message. It's not a message that brings shame. Well, why not? Because every other religious message is a message of shame. It is always a message of how we don't and can't measure up. So why not be ashamed of this gospel? And he says, well, because it is the power of God to save us, not us to save ourselves. Well, how is he able to save? How does his gospel save? It saves because it reveals God's own righteousness. Right? And we discussed that righteousness is not a standard necessarily to be met in Christianity. It's not just a standard. It is a gift that is given. God has revealed his righteousness to us. It is something we can receive by faith. That is how his power works to save us. Why is that important? Why is it important that we know that God's righteousness saves and we need this salvation? Why do we need it? Why must we know about it? Because it is not just his righteousness that is revealed from heaven. It is also his wrath that is revealed. And we go, well, how are we supposed to know that? Is it even fair that God would judge us in our ignorance or lack of understanding? How are we supposed to know? And Paul's answer is that God has made it plain through creation, that he exists and that he can be known. And so we are without excuse. Well, who then does his wrath fall on? It falls on everyone who does not then honor God as God. We know him. We know of him. but we refuse to worship him. And it is those for whom the wrath of God is reserved. This is, as we said last week, the fundamental sin of every man. We see it clearly in verses 23. It's repeated again in verse 25. We served the creature rather than the Creator. That is the fundamental sin. All other sins flow out from that one as its consequence. Verse 25 goes on to say, we worship the creature rather than the Creator, who is blessed forever. Amen. And that's the true ordering of things, right? There is one who is worthy of eternal glory, of eternal honor and blessing and worship. And so the correct order is to have God at the top. He is the object of our ultimate worship. And everything else fits in its place under him. But for all who refuse to worship him in such a way, God reserves his wrath. Well, what then does his wrath look like? By the way, the fact that all other sin flows out from the sin of not worshiping and honoring God correctly, I think, gives us the answer to the confusing statement in verse number 27 that men committing shameless acts with men and receiving in themselves the due penalty of their error. And people have often wondered, well, what is that penalty? And lots of offerings have been made as to what the answer is. Is it AIDS? Is it some other physical disease? Is there something else going on here? What is the penalty that they receive for not worshiping God appropriately and giving themselves over to sexual sin? And I think the answer, in the context that we're supposed to understand, the penalty is the sin itself. That's the penalty. God has given them over to this. And you're going to find, because again, I know the part that doesn't quite jive with us here is we go, well, that doesn't seem much like a penalty. People are getting what they want. How is that a penalty to let people get what they want? And we don't get the full answer here until chapter 2, when Paul says what they're doing is storing up for themselves wrath. In other words, it's building. It's piling up. The consequences that are coming, the judgment, the wrath that they are earning for themselves. C.S. Lewis said, we said this last week, there are basically two kinds of people. Those who say to God, thy will be done, and those to whom God says, all right then, have it your way. We either worship God, or we worship something else of our own manufacture. Something that we think will get us closer to what we want, what we feel we need. So the consequences really flow out, and what Paul does here is give us two broad categories of the kinds of consequences that we can expect when we abandon the worship of God and worship something else. And the first of them we saw last week, disordered passions. Disordered passions, disordered desires, we might say. You see this from verses 24 to 27. And this focus on sexual deviance, sexual misconduct. And we answered the question, why does he focus on that right off the bat? And I believe he's using it, not because that's the worst of all sins, but because it is evidence clearly of our disordered passions. It's evidence that we have ordered our lusts in such a way that contradicts the creative intention and the laws that God has given. That sex is to be confined within the covenant of marriage. It's a vivid picture of the disorder of our worship displayed through our bodies, which belong ultimately to Christ. So when we commit such sin, we're taking the natural order God has created and we're essentially throwing it out the window in favor of our own order, which prioritizes our cravings and our lusts. Which means then that homosexuality is a particularly vivid example of our refusal to worship God. Again, I don't think his point is that it's it's so much more immoral. I think his point is that it is so much more unnatural. Because that kind of a sexual relationship between people of the same gender is a further disordering of the order that God created, because it's undermining the natural order of creation itself. God made them male and female to be husband and wife. But it is also undermining the procreative mandate to multiply and fill the earth, which requires man and woman. That's the first set of consequences: disordered passions. So when we look at the world around us that is given to sexual disorder, to sexual deviancy, this changes the way we see those people, doesn't it? It's not just people that, man, I don't even understand how you can do the things you're doing. These are people under the wrath of God, reaping the consequences of their behavior, storing up wrath for a future day of judgment. God has given them up to the lusts of their own heart. But it doesn't stop there. The second consequence Paul mentions, the second group, is that of a disordered mind. We have a disordered heart, and we have a disordered mind. And so verse 28 says, "And since they did not see fit to acknowledge God, God gave them up to a debased mind to do what ought not to be done." This becomes doubly concerning because if my passions are out of order, we would hope that at least our minds would step in and go, whoa, okay, this is not a good path. And maybe we can reason ourselves back into safer behavior that more rightly aligns with the way that God has created us and what he has intended us to do. But if the wrath of God, if the judgment against us extends to our minds, we are truly in a pickle. Because we might be tracking towards the wrath of God, storing up wrath, and it doesn't even compute with us any longer. It doesn't add up. We don't see where we're headed. In other words, this second moves the conversation from our hearts to our heads, or from our passions to our discernment. Our ability to discern between right and wrong. That is what is at stake in this second set of consequences, the debased mind. Now, what does that word, what does it mean, a debased mind? The word literally means something like disqualified or unfit for service. God gives us minds that are unfit. Well, unfit for what? Well, he tells us they're unfit to do what ought not, or they're unfit to do what ought to be done, if we're to put it in those terms. It's unfit to discern between right and wrong. They're unfit to know the difference between right and wrong. It's people who call wrong right and right wrong. In other words, folks, the wrath of God is seen in the withholding of wisdom and sound judgment. Those who are experiencing his wrath, those who are storing it up, are incapable of discerning the right path. Meaning not that they will never make any right decisions ever. Okay, some Christians have gone that far. It doesn't mean that they never get things right. It doesn't mean that they're not smart. But it does mean that any right moral decision that is made is evidence of God's common grace towards them. Is evidence that he has not yet left us completely to our own fate. And those in this condition are completely vulnerable then to all kinds of sin. And so Paul's going to run a list of sins here. And this list is not comprehensive. It's not trying to list every possible sin that they could possibly commit. It's representative, though. It's giving a representation of all kinds of sin across the spectrum. A lot of these sins, you'll notice, some of them overlap each other. There's a lot of similarities between them. And I think what this means then is that we're not really meant to spend a lot of time discerning the nuances of the differences between all of these words. I mean, we can, and there can be some fruit in that. But to do that, I think, might cause us to miss the bigger picture just a little bit. Now, we're going to do some of that. But the point is not that we should agonize too much over every single word. Paul is listing this representation of kind of the gambit of sin, and he's doing it in such a way that it impresses upon us that those with disordered passions and disordered minds are capable and vulnerable of any kind of sin. Nothing is off the table. Therefore, nothing should be surprising. This list is not easily divisible in any way, but I do think there are 4 basic parts to this list. A couple of them a little more obvious than others, and 2 of them we completely lose in the English translation. You say, what do you mean? Well, for instance, the first 4 words that are mentioned in the original language, in the Greek language, they all end with the same 2 Greek letters. In our English language, it looks like an IA, an ia. They all end with the same 2 letters, which means if you were reading this in Greek, there would have been a certain poetry to what Paul was writing, a certain rhythm to what he was saying. So I don't usually do this. I don't usually give you like Greek and Hebrew words because I don't think it's very helpful, and I usually just sound a little silly trying to say them anyway. But because Paul wrote it this way intentionally, I'm going to read those words to you so you can hear what Paul is doing. So verse 29 says, they were filled with all manner, and here's the Greek, adikia, poneria, pleonexia, and kakia. You hear that? The ia, one after another. What do they mean? That first word is translated unrighteousness. And this brings us all the way back to verse number 18, doesn't it? Verse number 18, where Paul writes, the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men. And that's interesting because verse 18 says that our unrighteousness is the reason we receive God's wrath. It gets revealed against us for our unrighteousness. But verse 29 says it's also a consequence of our unrighteousness. God has given us up to do, or given them up to do what they wanted to do. Our unrighteousness invites God's wrath and is the consequence of his wrath all at the same time. And so what we find is people who just keep doing it, storing up more and more wrath. Unrighteousness basically means, we covered this a couple of weeks ago, so we won't spend a ton of time here, but it basically means I don't measure up. I don't meet the standard. I fall short over and over again. Paul's going to tell us in just a couple of chapters, there is none who is righteous. No, not one. And listen, I don't have to convince you of that. I still believe I do. I think you know it. I think we all know it. And I think the fact that we know it is the reason we're so crazy. It's the reason we carry around so much anxiety and stress. It's the reason we can't get along with each other. It's the reason we don't even get along with ourselves half the time. Why? Because deep down we know. We don't measure up. We don't measure up. There's this standard, and I can't quite get there. It's unrighteousness. The next word is evil, just kind of a general word for wrongdoing. Covetousness. I do want to spend a minute here. Covetousness is basically desiring what you cannot have at a time when you cannot have it. It's wanting something you cannot have at a time when you cannot have it. It's not that the thing is wrong, but for whatever reason, in the moment, in this time, God was like, this is not for you. It's maybe for someone else, but not for you. One author put it this way. We can describe covetousness as a life-dominating, intense craving or desire for something. It means to invest the main part of your hope and happiness in something. It is an out-of-order desire, which sounds an awful lot like the consequence category we're talking about. Out-of-order passions and judgments. The 10th commandment helps us to identify what covetousness might look like. Exodus chapter 20, God has Moses write, "You shall not covet your neighbor's house. Shall not covet your neighbor's wife, or his male servant, or his female servant, or his ox, or his donkey, or anything that is your neighbor's." In other words, folks, you know your heart is disordered when you want what belongs to someone else. It's one thing, isn't it, to see a friend's house and have an admiration for it, maybe to even be happy for them. But it's something else entirely to want it, or to want something comparable to it. To compare and go, why do they get this and I've got this? It's not fair. I want it. Why do they deserve it more than I do? It's another thing to tell yourself how much happier you would be if you could have it. Shall not covet your neighbor's house. Shall not covet your neighbor's wife, spouse. Husbands are tempted to say, man, if only my wife looked like his wife. If only my wife cooked like his wife. If only my wife were as nice as his wife. Wives are tempted to say, man, if only my husband were more like her husband. Had as much hair as he does. If only he were more attentive. If only he were more helpful. You know, the middle part of this 10th commandment, we tend to take a break with, right? Like, whew, all right, I have never coveted my neighbor's donkey. All right? There's a part of this command I don't have to worry about, but hang on a second. There's that weird section about don't covet your neighbor's male servant or female servant or donkey, and we're like, whew, all right, I am clear. But hang on, what was all of that? All of that in that ancient culture, that was like industry, that was like possession, that was material gain, that was financial wealth, that was future security. That meant having a food to eat. Meant having a business to run. And isn't it easy for us to look around and go, man, I deserve that raise just as much as he did? Or, man, if only I had the kind of money that they do, if only I had the car that they do, if only I could take the vacations that they do. See, you do covet your neighbor's donkey, don't you? And then he just throws out the all-encompassing, or anything that is your neighbor's. I wish I could be as strong as him. I wish I could be as beautiful as her. If only I could make friends as easily as they do. If only I had that thing, that toy, that game. What are we doing? What we're doing, folks, is we are investing our hope and our happiness into things that do not currently belong to us. And listen, when you do that, when you invest your hope and happiness into things that do not currently belong to you, you are subjecting your hope and happiness to loss. Why? Because none of those things are permanent. None of them are truly sufficient for your happiness. You know your heart is disordered when you want what belongs to someone else. I would say also that you know your hearts are disordered here with covetousness when you can't seem to find contentment. When you always feel like you need the next thing in order to be truly happy. You know what that says? It says you you might have a struggle with covetousness. And by the way, it's a big deal. Paul later calls covetousness, he equates it with idolatry. All who are covetous. And then he says, that is to say, idolaters. You know what he's saying? Covetousness is a sign of your own disordered worship. You've put something in a place, something in a category where only God belongs. And you're expecting of it things that only God can give and do and provide. And because you're doing that, you are subjecting your own happiness and contentment to loss. And some of you are losing that happiness, that contentment every single day. And you can't figure out why. And you think it's because God is stingy. You think it's because God won't give you what you need and what you truly want. And that is not the answer. You know how I know it's not the answer? Because one of these days you might get it. And it's going to wear out. And it's not going to do for you what you think it's going to do. You've had this experience. You know what it is. You know it because every time you get down and you go to retail therapy, you know what that is? Or I go buy something and it makes me feel better and I get the high, right? I get the clothes or the car or the shoes or whatever. It feels good for a minute. It feels good for a minute. And then it starts to diminish, doesn't it? And then I need something else. Folks, the problem is not that we don't have what we need to be happy. The problem is we're investing our happiness in the wrong places, in the wrong people, and in the wrong things. No wonder Paul lists covetousness. Unrighteousness, evil, covetousness. Then he concludes this first group of four with malice, which is another word for evil. Here's where, this kind of overlaps with the second word. It means evil or wrongdoing, or sometimes has the connotation of someone who is severe. You don't have a lot of compassion. These first four words seem to describe the general condition of the human heart. The kind of heart that is ultimately capable of all kinds of sin. It is a heart that is given to evil and malice. It is a kind of heart that doesn't measure up, that cannot measure up, that will never measure up on its own. It's the kind of heart that is discontent, coveting what it does not have when it cannot have it. And like a cancer, sin metastasizes and it spreads its tentacles through our hearts, seeking more and more control until it finally destroys the thing that it occupies, rendering it completely non-functional. And that's kind of the point that Paul is making, right? Like a cancer, it spreads until it destroys, rendering our minds unfit, lacking wisdom and discernment. Why? Because sin is like a cancer. It destroys that which it occupies. And so, our minds are unfit, lacking wisdom, lacking discernment. This is part of the judgment of God, which means self-diagnosis becomes really unlikely. Right, verse 22, Paul says, claiming to be wise, they became fools. Self-diagnosis becomes really unlikely. Because the person given over to disordered passions and a disordered mind that doesn't have the ability perhaps to even understand. They can't see it. It's confusing to them. It's more likely that people in this condition will begin to see everyone else as the problem. Those people, they're just out to get me. They're trying to hurt me. They're trying to take from me. They don't understand who I am or what I'm doing or what I'm about. And folks, if you're not careful, you're going to isolate yourself from those who are truly trying to help you. You'll end up gathering to yourself people who embolden you in the wrong path rather than confront you when you're on the wrong path. And that's really the full circle. If you drop all the way down to verse number 32 of chapter 1, Paul says they know God's righteous decree that those who practice such things deserve to die. They not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. This is why God is constantly telling us how important it is to stay in His Word and with His people in the church, because sin is deceptive and destructive. It will ruin your ability to discern right and wrong, and it will cause you to surround yourself with people who are encouraging you in the wrong direction until you become someone who begins to encourage other people in the wrong direction. So, folks, when you see someone, or maybe you even feel in yourself the desire to pull away from those who know you best, those who are willing to speak the hard truth to you, that's a warning sign. Sin may be deadening your ability to think clearly. The second group of 5 words all kind of go together because they are all connected with the little word, they're words in English, full of. Right? They're full of envy. They're full of murder, strife, deceit, and maliciousness. Let's park on this word envy for just a moment because it lots of overlap here with covetousness, but there is maybe just a minor distinction. Jonathan Edwards said that envy is a spirit of dissatisfaction. That sounds an awful lot like covetousness, right? It's a spirit of dissatisfaction and here's the part that might be a little distinct, opposition to the prosperity and happiness of others. See, envy goes a step further. Envy takes the hidden root of covetousness and weaponizes it against other people. Not only do I just want what you have, but I don't want you to have it either. I want you to lose. Tim Keller said that envy is being happy at other people's unhappiness and unhappy with other people's happiness. It weeps when others rejoice and rejoices when others weep. But it's really hard to deal with envy. It's really hard to deal with. You know why? Because not only is it a matter of the heart like covetousness, which means sometimes we can harbor that unhappiness towards other people's success. We can just cover it up and hide it and put on the right face. Not only, though, is envy a matter of the heart like covetousness, but it really, really wants to remain hidden. It is a notoriously shameful feeling, isn't it? Have you ever identified this kind of envy in yourself? Have you ever been, that person lost something, and in me there was a glimmer of satisfaction. Or that person got something, and in me, I didn't want him to have it. I was not happy for them. There's a lot of frowny faces coming back this way. And I think it's because we all know what it is, and not a single one of us wants to admit it. Why? Because it makes us look so petty, doesn't it? Isn't it just such a shameful thing to even admit we struggle with? It wants to stay hidden. It shames. And so we want to cover it. We don't want to admit it. A lot of other sins come with good feelings, doesn't it? Anger. You ever blow up at somebody? There was a moment where it's like, yeah, that felt great. Gluttony, that feels pretty good for a while. Lying, there's a thrill to that. Lust, right? Lots of other sins come with good feelings, but envy makes you feel miserable from beginning to end. There's no good part to it. You want to test, by the way? Am I envious? Here it is. Are you happy when someone fails or struggles? We're like, yeah, that's what they deserve. Do you struggle when someone else succeeds and not you? Listen, can I just be real honest? I felt it. I know exactly what this looks like. I felt it even in ministry. Sometimes the temptation to be frustrated when the Lord blesses the ministry of someone else and they're seeing tremendous fruit and growth, or the temptation to feel a little satisfied when those same people experience a struggle. What is that? It's the root of envy. And it's wicked. and it's hidden. It's the result of a disordered mind. We don't see what is truly valuable. We want what cannot satisfy. I got to pick up the pace here just a little bit, I think. Murder and strife are the next two he mentions here. It's easy to see the connection between this one, by the way, and envy. James makes this connection very clear for us. James chapter 4, verses 1 and 2, you remember what he says? What causes quarrels and fights among you? Like, why can't you get along with each other? He's like, you know why? It's your passions. And we got disordered passions, right? And they're at war in us. You desire to have, and you can't get it. So what do? You murder. You covet. You cannot obtain. So you fight and quarrel. But you don't have because you don't ask. You don't ask, and you ask and you don't get it because you're asking wrongly. You're asking for things that you want to invest your hope and happiness in. And that's disordered worship. Folks, often the reason we don't get along with other people, often the reason that we are in strife with other people, often the reason that we would like to murder some people is because we are envious of them. We want what they have and we can't get it. So like Cain, we go to war with them, and we may not pick up a stone and smash them in the head. We're far too civilized for that, most of us, hopefully. But we do seethe with anger. Or we punish them by keeping them at a distance, or we find reasons to dislike them. The next word he mentions is deceit. Willing to say whatever you need to say in order to control or to manipulate other people or the situation. Deceive. Even if it means hurting other people. Maliciousness. Interesting word because it's the only time this word is used in the entire New Testament. It has the word malice in it. You remember that word just a few minutes ago? It has that word in it. But it also has the word for like custom or pattern. And so it means something like wicked or destructive customs. And I don't think what Paul has in mind here, I don't think this is simply like the destructive habits that we do against ourselves. I think what he means is the kind of wicked customs or patterns that are in place in our homes or in our societies that hurt other people. And so you put all five of these words together, they are filled with these five things, and together they seem to prove that sins of the heart rarely stay there. They metastasize and they spread out and they hurt other people. They find a way out. They begin to produce fruit in you that will look ugly and taste bitter to those around you. There's a lesson to be had here. It's that our disordered minds are not just for us to suffer with. The sinful choices we make often have ripple effects that bump into other people, often the people that are closest to us, and they're left dealing with the ramifications of our disordered minds. Our own foolish decisions. The sins of the heart tend to find a way into the fruit of life. The fruit of the flesh that Rich read for us earlier. The next 8 things that Paul mentions all seem to emphasize just how far sin will take us. And it will take us to shocking places. He says there are gossips and slanders. These are people willing to destroy the reputation of others. Whether you're doing it behind the scenes, sharing stories of other people, prayer requests. This is how we get away with this in church, right? We're sharing stories with other people, and really what we're doing is airing dirty laundry that's not ours to air, right? That's gossip. Or whether we are intentionally attacking someone's character. Just slander. Which, by the way, is not just spreading a story. You're actually spreading specific conclusions about someone's motives or character. Folks, that is the activity of someone with a disordered mind. A disordered mind that doesn't know what to value, doesn't know the difference between right and wrong. And you think hurting people is right because it makes you look better, feel better. It helps you deal with the shame of your own envy. if I can just bring them down a couple of notches. It makes me feel included and wanted if I can share a story that you didn't know. I feel important, right? I have a disordered mind. It doesn't compute with me that loving other people as I love myself is really the way to success. What really feels like the way to success is to trample on people on the way to the top. I have a disordered mind. They're haters of God. This is a shocking statement that emphasizes the complete depth of their sin. And reminds us that sin is not just a matter of preference or mistake. It's a position of the heart against its creator. They're insolent. This means they hurt people. They're willing to mistreat someone for their own advantage. They're haughty and boastful, or in other words, they're self-centered. They're convinced of their own superiority and importance. They're inventors of evil, which speaks to their creativity. Listen, Proverbs is right. There is nothing new under the sun, but you know what we're really good at? Creating new ways to commit the same old sins. We're inventors of evil. And then he throws this one in here. This is the terror to every child. Disobedient to parents. Can you believe it? Like he lumps that one in with like haters of God. And insolent, willing to hurt people. Disobedient to parents? I'm looking around, making sure my kids are paying attention right now. Why is this one here? Because what he's saying is that people with disordered minds are willing to harm the closest relationships, even those within the home. They're willing to reject, to resist, and to harm even those relationships. It's evidence of a mind that's not working properly. A mind and a heart that is disordered, unfit. The final four, Paul ends with another rhetorical flourish here. The first four words all ended with the same two letters. The last four words all begin with the same letter. They all begin with what is in English an A. So I'm going to read it for you again. Asunetos, asunthetos, astorgos, analeemon. That one's a tough one. What are these words? It kind of rings pretty well. There's some decent poetry to this that remains even in the English. Foolish, faithless, heartless, ruthless. They're foolish. What does that mean? They're without sense. They're faithless. They're without trustworthiness. They're heartless. They're without feeling or natural affection, and they are ruthless. They are without mercy. In other words, they lack the basic qualities necessary for human flourishing. They can't be trusted to make good decisions, and even when they do make good decisions, they can't be trusted to carry out the plan. And when they fail or when they let you down, they won't care. They're just looking out for themselves, and if you happen to be in their way as they try to make their way to the top or get what is theirs, they will not think twice about trampling you or your heart or your desires. Folks, with minds that are under the judgment of God, there is no sin that is too far out of bounds. And doesn't this really describe our day? Doesn't it answer the question we all ask sometimes when we're watching the news? What's the question you ask? Don't we find ourselves asking often, how? How can there be so much evil? How can people do what they do? How can we be given to so much sin? Folks, the answer Paul gives us is that these people are those whose hearts and minds are being subjected to the wrath of God. Even as it looks like they are winning in life, they are storing up wrath. Paul goes further still, verse 32, though they know God's righteous decree, that those who practice such things deserve to die, they not only do them, but give approval to those who practice them. In other words, they know what they deserve. This is a shocking realization, isn't it? They know what they deserve. I mean, can it be really? Is that really true? It doesn't feel like it, doesn't. It doesn't feel like people know that they deserve punishment from God. But you know, Paul's right. You ever stop to consider how in the world we all came to agree on certain moral decisions, moral values, like murder? And murder's just always wrong. Property rights, generally wrong in most modern culture, to take what doesn't belong to you. Are these things coincidence? Is it a result of evolution? Are they culturally conditioned? Folks, the answer is, and we'll see this next time in chapter 2, so I'm not going to spend a ton of time here. The answer is that God has written a code into our hearts. Like our hearts come with an operating system. It's called the conscience. And it gets corrupted by culture and by sinful desires that reign in our own body, but it's there. And it may not be functioning well, but it's there. And we see it in the fact that we can all look at each other and agree not to kill each other this morning, because that would be wrong. They know what they deserve. The second thing Paul wants us to understand, though, as he closes this portion, is that misery loves company. And so they encourage other people to come into the destructive path with them. Let me conclude with this. In the midst of all this talk of disordered passion and disordered minds and all these sins, and now we're all feeling a bit guilty, none of us escape this unscathed. But listen, and I want us to hear this as we close. There is only one person in all of human history who got it all right, who faced all the same temptations we have faced, yet he never sinned. Why? Because his heart and his mind were properly ordered. John 17:1, as Jesus is coming to the end of his ministry, as a matter of fact, hours before he would be betrayed to murder, he said this. He lifted up his eyes to heaven and he said, Father, the hour has come. Glorify your Son, that the Son may glorify you. You see that? Rightly ordered worship. A few verses later, he says, I, Father, glorified you on earth, having accomplished the work that you gave me to do. Folks, in other words, Jesus never wavered from that primary goal. He was never guilty of knowing God, but failing to honor him as God. Not even one time. He never for a moment desired anything more than he desired the Father. He was never covetous. He was never envious. Even when he had everything to lose and we had everything to gain, he gave it so that we might win through his victory. He never wavered from the primary goal, which means he was never deserving of God's wrath. If the wrath of God was revealed against all who failed to properly worship and honor him, then Jesus was completely innocent, yet he died anyway. Why? Isaiah 53 gives us the answer. Yet it was the will of the Lord, it was the will of God to crush him. He has put him to grief. When his soul makes an offering for guilt, he shall see his offspring. Folks, he, the innocent, he, the guiltless, was put under the wrath of God, not because he deserved it, but because we did. He went out of a desire for the glory of God, and the ultimate glory would be given to God through his love for us. Love for those whose hearts and minds were so disordered that we deserve nothing but his wrath. But Jesus suffered that wrath so that we wouldn't have to. That's what it means by his soul made an offering for guilt. It wasn't his guilt. He didn't have any. It was our guilt. Because he paid for our guilt, we can be his offspring. What a great and very non-envious exchange Jesus has made. The one who had everything to lose and nothing to gain gave up everything for us who had nothing to lose and everything to gain. We had nothing to offer. He was blessed, but he took our curse. He was son, but he took our exile. He was righteous, yet he became our sin. We, on the other hand, were cursed and he gave us his blessing. We were exiled, and he gave us sonship. We were sinners, and he gave us righteousness. Folks, what this means for us is that no matter how much of this list of sins you are guilty of, and listen, we're all guilty of all of them. So, well, I've never murdered anyone. Go read Matthew, right? Go read the Sermon on the Mount. You've hated without cause. Jesus says you're guilty. But no matter how many you are guilty of, no matter what depth of sin you have gone to, there is a way to be forgiven of all of it. All you have ever done. And when God forgives, he also says that he gives you a new heart. And he said, I will write my law on your heart. What is that? He's like, you know what? You can't reorder your heart on your own. You can't reorder your mind on your own. But you know what I'll do for you? I'll take that heart of stone, the heart of disordered passions, the heart that runs a disordered mind, and I'll give you a heart that beats from my glory. Folks, that's our hope. This is not a, hey, go out of here and really, we're just going to try in the best of our strength to do better at all these things. You're going to fall flat on your face over and over and over again. You know what you need? You need to reorient yourself around the glory of the risen Christ. Make him your priority. And find in him that you're accepted. Right? He'll help you deal with the rest. Let's pray. All right, Lord, all we can do, I think, is just to ask for you to help us. In some ways, going through a list like this can leave us feeling overwhelmed with the magnitude, the depth, the pervasiveness of temptation and sin. It is everywhere. It is outside of us. It is inside of us. And Lord, we long for the day when that very presence of sin is removed. But until that day, you have promised us victory. So Lord, help us to rightly value you, to rightly order and prioritize your worship above all else. Lord, I ask this in Jesus' name.